Welcome. I'm John Rooney. I'm a Senior Principal Consultant with CA Technologies in the North America region. What I'll be reviewing today with you is a CA World 2016 presentation on best practices enabling CA Workload Automation DE artifacts to move applications through the development lifecycle. As CA Workload Automation DE users take advantage of pre-production environments to test out their job flows, it has become more important to be able to migrate the DE artifacts from dev to production with as little manual intervention as possible. This talk will discuss the strategies and tools to use to create an automated process to migrate your DE artifacts through the lifecycle process. A quick agenda slide here. We'll be going through multiple environments and standards and why you need them. Use of symbolics, leveraging JavaScripts, IMEXutil, the import-export utility distributed with DE, and then a quick summary. First things first, the decision has to be made to use your enterprise workload product or not. A lot of cases are when we talk with customers and they give us feedback on what the policies that they have in place as to whether to use enterprise workload or not as a standard. What some of the questions that they ask the customers are, is the application business critical? Does the application have a business impact on revenue or service or the customer? If the answers are yes, then you need to use the standard enterprise-wide workload automation solution. So once you have a production workload instance, what is the value of a pre-production instance? Well, a pre-production instance is used to protect production. It minimizes the potential for production failure or outage. It is used for testing of application flows before reaching production. It is used for testing of application integrations in a pre-prod environment and enables better enterprise workload usage and visibility by working through any obstacles that may be involved with that integration before you reach production. Definitely, it is part of a DevOps implementation strategy. Another good reason for a pre-production instance is for testing of DE server upgrades and fixes. What are some potential issues with multiple DE instances? Well, first off, you'll have the manual effort to migrate artifacts from one instance to another. Along with that is the manual effort to change values like arguments in the applications and jobs. Also, changing event names and scheduling frequencies. Definitely, it is hard to keep artifacts in sync without good naming standards, so naming standards would definitely be a must. What are the potential issues with using a single CA Workload Automation DE instance? Harder to keep logical separation when you have a single database there. Application names have to be unique within a DE instance. You cannot have different active versions of the same application name at the same time. Need to change application names like adding a suffix or prefix to enable multiple applications within the same DE instance. So harder to maintain security profiles, although it can be done and is done by many customers, but it takes a little bit more to keep those security profiles in sync. Again, naming standards are a must whether using a single or multiple DE instances. So what's the value of creating naming standards? Easier to categorize artifacts for searching purposes. D-Series does have a find capability, but if you have good naming standards for your job names and application names, that can make it much easier to search for certain artifacts. Easier to determine ownership or responsibility. Easier to create and onboard new applications. easier to create and or clone security rules, easier to subscribe and monitoring. Monitoring only allows with the subscription a single application filter, so if you have good naming standards, then it can make it easier to see everything associated with what you'd want to see. And last but not least, enabling moving applications through a development lifecycle as part of your DevOps strategy, and that is the context of this talk here today. So what are some suggestions for DE artifact naming standards? A short business application name can be very useful as a prefix for DE artifacts. Event names should be an independent name and not associated with a real user ID. Example, using dev, test, or prod. Another suggestion for event names would be using a customer name or a distribution center. So that way you could have a prefix of DC1 for distribution center 1, DC2, DC3, and so on. What are the DE artifacts where the business application name can be used as a prefix? Well, at the event, you're going to have that event prefix like we just discussed, and then you would have a prefix before the application name. Where that prefix with the application name can be used is you'd have the prefix, you'd have the application name, and then that way everything is categorized with that prefix underscore application name. Very easy to search for things using that context, as well as setting up security rules for it. The runtime names can be overridden to that application name. So if you want to have something when it actually is running to be different than what's saved as the prefix and application name, you could certainly take advantage of that if you wanted to. Resources. If you have a resource with a prefix before the resource name, then you can also maybe put a one character for depletable, renewable, or threshold. It makes it very easy to identify the resource and what type of resource it is. So if you're troubleshooting from an operations standpoint or monitoring standpoint, or even scheduling standpoint, and you're wondering why something is waiting, it can make it very easy to troubleshoot and get down, pinpoint exactly what resource you're waiting for, and possibly where it was created or who the owner of that resource is. Similarly, for security groups, having that prefix for the group name can also be helpful, because you could, if it's like DC1 is the prefix, you could have DC1 underscore group as the group name, and it makes it very easy to identify the people that are part of that group. You could also use it as a context name for global variables. So DE artifacts where the business application name makes sense as a prefix for non-common artifacts. One would be alerts. Not a lot of people have done this so far, but if you do a prefix for your alert names, it also can make it easy from a security standpoint to make sure that all of your alerts are categorized completely there and in order, and you can also have security rules based upon that. JavaScripts. If you put JavaScripts with a prefix before the JavaScript name, this way you know who the ownership of it is, and it makes it very easy to from a security standpoint, to give access to certain people with those JavaScripts and not others. If you have calendar special days, maybe to identify what group that special day is for, you put in the prefix for it. This also can be very helpful from a troubleshooting standpoint, or when you're looking at the calendar and you're doing the updates or cleaning up the calendars, to know who those special days were created for. It can help from a turnover standpoint too, if you're bringing in new schedulers or moving schedulers around. Agent groups. You could do that for the agent group very easily provide the prefix, again, it's identification as to who is using that agent group and how it's being used. Here's some sample security settings for like an apps dev environment in pre-prod. We have the new option to deny subscribe all. The subscribe all we found in the past can hurt performance within D-series in the monitoring side of the house. So if you deny subscribe all to everyone, that can very much help out with performance. And you can also allow any event prefix, because by doing that you have less maintenance by allowing users to use their own user ID as a prefix for events. Again, naming standards for that might be that in an apps dev, a pre-prod environment, users use their own username as the event prefix, and that can make it easier for them to test out things. Or, as I'm showing here on the right hand side, you'll see that there's a lot of descriptions for, say, app 1. So in this case, with that standard naming convention, if they belong to a particular application group and they're only allowed to do those things, you could just put in that individual app name there and make it very easy to clone these rules, these permissions for other things as well, for other users and groups. There's some prefixes that I'll call static variables. These things won't change, and I would suggest that you use them as ESP prefixed variables in your environment. So first of all, you would use the environment name, like dev, test, or prod, and you would save that because you may be using that in your naming convention and standards later on for either names or environment names on paths and other things in your arguments. The host name and port can be helpful. That way, if you upgrade your D-series instance, or you're moving it from dev or test to prod, and you're using utilities like the CLI or the IMEXutil, you may need to put in the host name and port for connection purposes. Well, having one spot to do that across the whole DE instance can make it very helpful. So that way, as you're migrating, or whether you're upgrading or changing, you never have to change it in your individual job. So it can save you a lot of time and energy later on. There's a server home directory also is applicable to that same context with those utilities. Whenever you're doing things, running things out of the bin directory, like the CLI or the IMEXutil, and you're going to change it from one instance to the other, well, those server home directories may be different. So that way you would keep them the same by doing it as a ESP prefix variable and then having them resolved at runtime. The DE server ID is also another one that can be helpful if you're running different utilities, say ESP-MGR or some other utilities where you need to have the server ID and provide that as part of the utility. Database and FTP user IDs in a lot of cases are standard across the environment that you're in. So instead of having specific ones and that you need to change in some symbolic somewhere, if you do it as an ESP prefixed one, then you can use that as a standard across the board. The symbol library or JavaScript that you execute for default symbolics may also be a standard, so you could even use that as a ESP prefixed variable there. So dynamic variables would be the application and WAB prefix ones, because these are things that will change quite frequently. So dates change all the time. The scheduled date would be the same for, say, a 24-hour period, but it's going to change every day. So it's more of a dynamic variable than it is a static variable. agents can also be a dynamic variable instead of a static, because the agents will change as you move through the life cycle. Directories and paths, database servers, email IDs used for notifications, times, SLAs, critical jobs. All these things may be different as you go through the life cycle, as well as specifically job names and qualifiers. You may want to qualify them as you move through. So those things will also be different and not really categorized as a static variable. Here's a sample JavaScript to create date symbolics that you could use in various formats. So I have one customer who has a very long, complicated symlib with lots of times that they've already created. So they use the GenTime utility in the series to create standard names that can be used for plus and minus from the relative schedule date of when it either in days or months format, and you concatenate those things together to make very specific names. So when you look at the environment variable names on the right hand side there, P0 or M1 as the starting point of it, but then you'd have the date in A format or B format or C format or D format. So this way you can make these things and publish them. That way people don't have to keep asking for a different way of referencing the same thing, because you're going to reuse those same environment variables across the board for everyone. So it's a good idea to publish them and maybe even make the an example of the symlib with the different formats showing as examples, and publish that to your customers so they know what they look like. You could also have a sample default global variable context. So if you do it as global, as a default, as the name is the context, then when you're moving it through the life cycle, it makes it easy to know which one it is, because you're not going to change the name from default to something else unless it helps out to have it as a separate one, because different lines of business. So all these things, you could have all your defaults in there, and some examples that I gave before are in here. So you would have things like say a database server or user, possibly if it's different for each application instead of using it as an ESP prefixed ones. So you could leave all the applications alone, and then you can have separation of duties for updating values. You could have a different organization that could go in and update the global context, but really not have any authority to update the applications themselves. So what are some ways to minimize or eliminate changes while moving through the lifecycle using JavaScript? Well, the first thing is to define a default context with those static variables defined in the event. May not need to move the event through the lifecycle. So I'm just going to create something to create the static variables. So now I have something that's static in that environment. Then you can define the dynamic variables in a JavaScript defined in the application or at event trigger time. That way you could have date symbolics for past, present, and future dates. You could embed JavaScripts in the job definition for values that need to be set just before the job is executed. So if you're doing it, embedding a JavaScript in the job definition, then that actually moves it along through the life cycle, and you're probably have less variability of names in those environments, because everything will be done within the job and not relying upon outside sources. Or you can invoke repository-based JavaScripts for generic functions. So what are some ways to minimize or eliminate changes while moving through the life cycle? try to make it so that everything is a standalone application and it has little or no reliance upon extra artifacts like JavaScript. So you could use a link as an Apple start or Apple end as functions in your application to execute JavaScript, to set up other jobs, in order to keep the application as self-sufficient as possible. In a lot of cases, it's suggested to consider using the %if function in various job definition fields, because you could use that based upon, say, what environment you're in, or make other decisions with the %if, so that way you're building a self-sufficient type of atmosphere, but it could be dependent upon which environment you're in. So one decision could be, if you are in dev, then I execute this job. The start might be at 6 p.m. But if I'm in prod, then I'm executing it at 10 p.m. You could also consider creating application standards for deploying applications. So you might want to consider doing standard directory names in pre-prod and prod, which will help to minimize the need for creating exception symbolics. So if the only thing that changes is the home directory, or if the directory is the same and the directory structure is the same through the life cycle, then you have less exceptions and less changes that you need to make through the whole life cycle. Unix and Linux are interchangeable job types. So we do have some customers that test with Unix systems in pre-prod and then Linux in production. Well, those job types are the same, so it makes it very easy to not have to change anything when you're going through the life cycle that way. Agent grouping or agent alias. If you're using random or round robin with it, you can create an agent group with the name of the application, and this was suggested earlier in the presentation, where you create an agent group. You could have one or many agents within the group, but if you put it as a group name, you don't have to worry about what the real agent names are behind the scenes, because you can do the random or round robin and not do CPU in that case. So that way you don't have to worry about agent names or changing agent names through the life cycle, because I'm really using a group name instead of a real name, and then it's up to your administrators to make sure that they'll create the correct agents in the correct agent groups for each of the environments. But it certainly can cut down one of the biggest pains that the customers have, which is the changing of the agent names through the life cycle. The other way is using agent alias. So you don't have to define the real agent name in the DE topology to use a particular agent. You can use what we call the communication alias name for it. So in that way you can mimic really any agent in any environment, and as a matter of fact we really take advantage of this in the pre-sales area within CA. When we're showing customers some of their own data, we can run things through, but we can mimic their agent names because we can use an alias for it and have a specific real agent names behind the scenes for that. So in this case, you could use your production agent name. So instead of using the agent grouping, which I mentioned on the previous slide, you could use the real agent name in pre-prod. You could use the production agent name. So, and all you're doing is you're mapping that real agent name with an alias name of a production name. So that way you can use the same agent names throughout the life cycle and never have to worry about changing agent names. This can also be helpful when you're retiring an agent, because you can switch agents without changing job definitions immediately. So in other words, you can create a new agent with an alias of the old agent name. At cutover day, you just cut over and change the host name or DNS of where it's going to, and now you can start using that new agent before you delete the old one. And the IMEX util, the import-export utility, is definitely something you want to leverage in moving things through the lifecycle. And what I would recommend is taking a backup and exporting out all your artifacts, because it is another way of backing up the whole instance. So I recommend backing up using the exporting out of all the DE artifacts on a regular basis, because if you ever have to restore an individual artifact for some reason, now you don't have to worry about restoring the database, because you have a copy of all the individual artifacts. Certainly helpful for things like JavaScripts that don't have versioning, maybe not so much for applications which do have the versioning already built in for it. So using the import-export utility, you can create a software change process to move from a pre-prod instance to a production instance. The one caution here is using the utility, you cannot use the utility if your pre-prod and prod are different releases. As a matter of fact, this is just a caution anyway, that during that time frame when pre-prod and prod are on different releases, the schema may be different between the two releases, so you may not be able to export out, save it, and then import in, because the schema being changed, the utility changes with it, so that when you try and load it, it won't be able to work with it. This usually doesn't apply to SP releases. It's usually for other releases like 11.3 to 12.0. Here's an example of exporting out a particular application. In this case, what I use this for is exporting out a particular application name. So you'll see in the arguments to pass at the end, I use the %apple._user1. That would have been passed as a user1 parameter when I triggered this event. So I can trigger this event, pass an application name, and then I can export out just that name to some directory. And my directory here I just call SEM test to prod, and then a particular application name. Importing would just be the opposite, where I'm just using the import of it. I'm going to use an import command for it, and then specify an application that I'm importing there. The application parameters can also be used with a template for the application. So in a lot of cases, you can execute dynamically using our web services or SOAP services. And so as a way of moving things through a life cycle, you can have application parameters defined in your application. And on the left-hand side there, it's all the ones that start with %evar for event variables or application parameters is what it's under the event name. So any %evar you can retrieve from the application and get all list of those names, and then save them and override them. So this way, you're moving the application through the life cycle and not the event. So the event parameters would stay static, but the application can change a little bit, and then you can retrieve from the application any additional application variables that would be defined there. So another way of minimizing or maximizing the use of the product by using things at the event level and doing more symbolics at the application level. If you're interested in executing a template using web services, there is a help screen for this, as well as when you get into the WSDL, there's examples for this of doing this, but you can do different functions like run application create, read, update, or delete. So you can actually create applications on the fly, events on the fly, executing an application. And so this is another way that you can do it instead of statically doing it through either the web UI or through the desktop client. So in summary, some upfront naming conventions can help out later when planning for the application lifecycle management. Definitely leverage JavaScripts and global variables for instance-related symbolics, and then use the IMEXUtil, because that can be very helpful for managing the actual movement of artifacts from pre-prod to prod. So thank you very much for all your time, and have a good day.